everyone this afternoon to the Northern Culture All-Party Parliamentary Group's inquiry into what Northern culture needs to rebuild, rebalance and recover. This is the first of our evidence sessions that we are having, it's great to have everyone here. There are going to be two panels this afternoon. The key questions around this evidence session are: how do we support and encourage young people's creativity and cultural job opportunities post-COVID? How do we boost skills, create equal opportunities for all, promote diversity and support ambitions to empower future generations? How do we help develop a supply chain for talent and harness what many towns and cities in the north have always done, act as a pool of talent with pathways into the creative sectors? And how do we increase higher levels of engagement with culture? So that is the kind of broad brush of what we are looking at in the inquiry. The housekeeping rules: this session will be recorded, as we've already said, and shared online in due course. And we encourage everybody to get involved and raise questions for our speakers in the chat. Join in the debate online using the hashtag Northern Culture Inquiry and tagging @NCAPPG. Gosh, that is a mouthful, but these things always are. But it is very important that we get this out there, what we are doing in this committee today. So in the first evidence session, we have got 5 people who are going to give us some introductory remarks and then answer questions. So I'm going to introduce each one in turn. We've got Rodri Talfin-Davies, who is the Director of Nations for the BBC. Very, very welcome, here you are today. Can you give us your few minutes introductory remarks, Rodri?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm actually based in Bristol these days, but as a former producer of Look North in Newcastle and North West Tonight in Manchester, I think I know the patch reasonably. Yeah, just a couple of quick things from a BBC perspective. I guess that the central mission of the BBC in terms of culture and creativity means that this is the agenda of your own committee is at the heart of what we do, promoting creativity and cultural activity in every part of the UK. And I guess that's partly down to the way that we're funded with a universal licence fee. There is a singular responsibility to promote culture in all its forms, even during lockdown with initiatives like Culture in Quarantine, trying to not only deliver our own programming, but to work with partners in every part of the UK to support access to the arts and ensure it's something that's engaging to everybody. And it's worth reminding the committee that, the BBC, even with all the competition we see today, is still serving about 90% of UK adults each and every week. So it has a reach and an impact across the UK that is utterly unrivaled. I think in terms of on the ground, I think 2 things to stress. I mean, one is economic activity. So if you look at the last financial year, 2019-20, the BBC was generating about £5 billion of economic activity in the UK economy, and about half that outside the M25, which is about an increase of about a third from where we were in about 2012. And we're directly supporting about 25,000 jobs beyond London too. In terms of activity in the north, again, just to give a sense of scale, right now we're producing around 13,000 hours of network radio programming from the north, and producing about 35,000 hours of television and radio in the north and for the north, whether that's the northwest, the northeast or the Yorkshire area. But we do recognise there's an awful lot more that we can do, and we've just set out a plan for the next 5 years. And the central goal there is to get closer to those audiences that are perhaps traditionally more distant from the BBC. And I would include some parts of the north in that. So it's about increasing the audience value that we deliver, very mindful of the fact we're taking a licence fee from everybody. but also the multiplier effect, thinking about how our activity drives economic, cultural, and social benefit. And in terms of the plan for the next 5 years, we want to get to a place where we're spending about half our television expenditure outside London at the moment. We want to move that up to 60%. And that means about an additional 700 million cumulatively being spent outside the M25 over the next 4 to 5 years. And then the key other part of the change is what services and programmes move to the north. We've already announced that BBC Three and BBC Radio 6 Music will be rooted in the north. We're moving Morning Live to Salford. We're putting additional commissioners both into Salford and into Newcastle, and the northeast in particular, a focus of our thinking at the moment. But also thinking carefully about the talent pipeline, because the most authentic drama, the most authentic comedy, the most authentic programming requires a creative pipeline. And activities like BBC Writers' Room, which will centre in Salford, are all about finding a next generation of writers from across the north to support our activity. And then on top of that, you've got a whole range of local services. And again, we want to dial up our impact here. And we want to launch additional services in areas like Bradford and Sunderland. We want to create learning hubs, places where people can go and develop digital literacy, address mental well-being, whole range of critical social issues. So we're talking about bespoke learning hubs in both Liverpool and Hull, but also moving more of our network teams out of London. So for example, the BBC's education team in future will be centred in Leeds. So it's about economic activity, but it's also with that cultural lens. How can we make sure more of our storytelling is rooted in the north? And that's about having troops on the ground, but also outstanding partnerships where we've really, where it's really worked on a regional basis. It's always been done in partnership with the right agencies and the right sectoral groups. So again, a big area of focus for us.
Great, thank you very much, Rodri. And it's lovely to hear you many places other than just Salford, because it's sometimes worrying me however good Salford has been, it's not the entire north. So it's lovely that you've mentioned.
I spent 6 very happy years growing up in Newcastle, so I understand well that Salford is not the sorry.
We'll let you off for that, coming from Sunderland.
All right. Well, I went there occasionally.
Anyway, thank you. We'll come back with some questions in a while, but I'm going to ask the other speakers to give their contribution. But that was a very wide-ranging few minutes. Thank you very much, Rodri. And our next presenter is Nick Grimshaw, who is Head of Partnerships at the Creative Industries Federation. Nick, would you like to give your introduction, please?
Good afternoon, Julie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me today. So yes, as Julie said, I'm Head of Partnerships at the Creative Industries Federation and Creative England. So we're an independent, not-for-profit organisation who represents, champions and supports the UK's creative industries across the country, but my focus in particular in the north. So we have a network of creative organisations, businesses, individuals who we work with in partnership across the north. And through those conversations, we're particularly over the last 12 months, as we've been understanding the impact of COVID and how the sector responds, we've been hugely encouraged by the critical value that is appreciated of culture, creativity, the creative industries in the recovery of the region. It's well appreciated, it's well understood, and it's viewed generally by partners as a key driver to enable us to build back better post-pandemic. So I think particularly within that, the role the sector plays in creating high quality jobs that pay decent wages and meet young people's career aspirations, enabling them to enjoy a high quality, fulfilling work life, but also in turn closing the gap on average earnings, on unemployment, on skills, education, aspiration, ambition for local communities. That's all very well understood. But I think also just like to share another few areas that I think conversations with partners in the north have particularly highlighted. And key regional strategic areas that I think will be useful for today's conversation. So particularly the driver for an economic growth. So prior to the pandemic, the industries were growing at, creative industries, sorry, were growing at 4 times the rate of the UK economy as a whole. So we experienced strong growth across the country, but in the north in particular. We're creating jobs at 3 times the rate of the UK average, employing 2 million people across all the nations and regions, and we contributed 116 billion in GVA during 2019. So that was a greater GVA contribution than aerospace, automotive, life sciences, oil and gas combined. So a hugely economically significant sector. But also they're a dynamic and growing sector that positions the North at the forefront of international competitiveness in our perspective. So that's one element that's well understood. I think key to retaining the next generation of creative talent in the region as well. So, you know, the creative industries represent a hugely popular career choice for young people. Therefore, they represent a powerful lever to ensuring talent that is born and bred in the region sees their home as their place to build their career, to live, to work, to spend. And I think also ensuring a diverse pipeline of talent. So higher education creative courses have comparatively strong diversity figures. So 1 in 10 students who accepted a place on an arts course indicated they had a disability. And that's substantially higher than the 1 in 20 average for broader higher education courses. Women are also very strongly represented, with 63% of arts courses acceptances identifying as women, which is 9% greater than the broader higher education rate. But research suggests that COVID-19 will exacerbate existing structural inequalities and underrepresentation in the creative industries. So keen to get into that a little bit today. But also the role that the sector plays at the heart of innovation. There's an acknowledgement that much innovation in other sectors actually draws on the creative businesses for its source. So innovation in tech, digital, immersive, VR, AR, they're revolutionizing the online retail experience, gaming, feeding into how businesses support consumer buying behavior, for example. So the creative industries are hugely innovative. 55% of creative firms state that they conducted R&D over the last 12 months. They're a driving force of innovation, both at a local and a global level, helping to regenerate high streets, helping to build local community cohesion, sustainability, providing dynamic solutions to global challenges, such as climate change, such as creative and digital technology. But also they're well understood in terms of their role that they play in the success of the government's plan for growth. A couple more points. The sector also provides an interesting model for the future of work. So some research undertaken by University of Sussex last year found out that organisations combining art and creative skills are 10% more productive and have 6% higher economic growth than the average. Also very future-proof jobs. So 87% of highly creative roles in the UK are at low to no risk of being automated. So very resistant to automation. And some modelling by McKinsey also highlights the demand for higher cognitive skills such as creativity, critical thinking, decision-making, complex information processing. Those are going to grow by significantly over the next decade, and those are what are particularly strong within the sector. And also in 2020, UK Createch attracted twice as much investment as the next biggest European market. So venture capitalists are also hugely invested and invested a record 981.8 million into UK Createch businesses over the last 12 months. But also the role in levelling up. So I think this is a lot of the conversations we have with partners across the North focus on the levelling up agenda. And I think the creative industries are seen as a motor for growth in local economies there. So not just in London, not just in the southeast, but across the UK. So in the northwest, for example, the sector's GVA grew by 39% between 2010 and 2018. There's also been an explosion in creative entrepreneurship that we're seeing. So almost 9 in 10 local economies grew their creative business population over this period. 83% of these grew their creative entrepreneurial community faster than other sectors as well. But creative education, I think, is essential to driving growth because it attracts, it cultivates, it retains the pipeline of vital skilled workers and creative entrepreneurs in the region. So I think just to kind of summarise, I suppose, some of the elements I'd like to draw on a little later in the conversation. So within the public sector, the North of Tyne Combined Authority, I think, have been particularly visionary in this space with their combined authority-wide 3.5 million creative growth and innovation programme over the next 2.5 years, which brings together investment in the sector alongside targeted industry-driven support for the sector. But there are also, I wouldn't want to highlight them alone, there are also similar intentions in the North, in Tees Valley Combined Authority, West Yorkshire Combined Authority, Sheffield City Region, Greater Manchester, Liverpool City Region as well, which is really encouraging to see. Similarly, within higher education, Northumbria University has been working in a partnership with New Writing North on an innovative initiative targeted at training and retaining talent in the North, next generation of writing talent in the Northeast. So I think the role of the sector as a driver of economic growth, which is absolutely at the heart of innovation, provides a model for the future of work, has a capacity to encourage and cultivate a diverse pipeline of talent, and has a critical role in enabling the government's levelling up agenda, is why it's so important that we harness the unique assets and the power of the Northern culture and creativity to shape the future for the North as we emerge from the effects of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Nick. Again, quite a wide-ranging thing, but interesting. You've also talked about how this can be such a driver for economic growth, as did Rodri. So that's an interesting two different areas, but same conclusions. So I'm going to bring in Kelly Allen next. Kelly is the Director for Social Justice at Curious Minds. Kelly.
Thank you, and thank you very much for asking me here today as well. Curious Minds are a creative arts and education organisation that work to create opportunities for young people across the Northwest and support the sectors involved to do more and better for young people. And I found it really useful to organise my thoughts thinking about this talent pipeline we keep talking about as a physical pipeline, and thinking about where that pipeline begins, who turns the tap on at the start, and where the potential blockages and leaks might be, and where that ultimately leads. And for me, as Nick said, that pipeline starts with arts and cultural experiences in schools, and there's no getting away from the fact that that is the most universal point of access, and it's also one that we could have the most direct influence over, that feels very important. And for me, national policy is going in the absolute direct opposite direction that we need it to at the moment in terms of creativity and culture in schools, and has been for some time. We're swimming against the tide here in terms of keeping that supply line going. So I'm really interested in what opportunities can we create to do something about that in the North, across our northern schools. I think the cultural sector's role is greater towards the start of that pipeline, and I know a lot of colleagues here from creative industries, so that's interesting for me. I think young people might choose to enter that pipeline for a number of reasons, and that may or may not be about employment, but regardless, it needs to be easy, so it has to be local, and it has to be attractive, and it has to be high quality. And to me, that means we've got to invest in grassroots organisations and local delivery to minimise the impact of the luck of where people happen to live and what's around them on their chances to enter this industry. I know from first-hand experience that high quality first engagements are the difference between people continuing or not continuing their journey into creativity and culture. So we have to be confident of consistently high quality first engagements in the North. And that, as I say, means investment in grassroots and local delivery, whether or not that comes to a school or outside of them, that those people need to be there. We need young people to know that this pipeline could lead them somewhere really positive and exciting. And I know colleagues here have done huge amounts about that. And I think a lot of progress has been made. And as Nick demonstrated, we need people to know that these are viable careers that they could build a life on. I'm not yet confident that the majority of adults around a young person would know how to advise, support and be knowledgeable in terms of creative careers. I think we're getting there, but I think the job isn't done yet and there's more work to do. So I wonder what we could do in terms of a joined up campaign across our sectors to make and reinforce these messages that these careers are viable and that we need people for it. We need to grow the talent to supply them. For those facing specific and systemic barriers, I think we really need the resources and the focus to tackle those blockages and the leaks head on. We need to make sure that the initiatives aimed at particular people actually do reach them. And for me right now, that feels more important than ever, because when usual routes into the pipeline contracting and constricting a little. Those who are already destined for this workforce will find other ways into it. And that may mean that the people are competing for different opportunities that are created at the moment. I think that targeted work is expensive, and it can be the first thing to go when people need to tighten their belts and budgets are tight. But with so much change that's been thrust upon us and our sectors over the last year and a half, we've got quite a unique window of opportunity now to make permanent changes that we've been struggling to achieve for years. So I would really like to see us harness this moment to keep the emphasis on targeted work and to make those permanent changes. And finally, from me, we all need to work together better to maintain this whole pipeline. So all the relevant sectors need to be clear about how each part of this pipeline affects the other and where the overlaps are and who's looking after which bit. And I think ultimately between us, we need to nurture an army of skilled and connected local leaders who've got the time and space to understand both ends of the pipeline and what their actions mean in the whole scheme of things, and can continue to be sat around each other's tables when these kinds of conversations and decisions are happening, like we are today. So I appreciate you making it happen and for inviting me to be here. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Kelly. And I couldn't agree with you more about resourcing people who really need the help, because one of the issues that I know I've come across over the years I've worked in this arena is the fact that a lot of people have to do internships to get experience, and at the minute most of them are in London, and if we can do anything to tackle that problem, it'll be a huge step forward. So I think you've highlighted one of the key issues we face in the broader north, but we'll come back to questions in a minute. Thanks, Kelly. And our next contributor is Mark Bailey, who is the Northumbria lead for Creative Fuse North East. Mark.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me and for listening. As an associate professor in innovation design at Northumbria University, I am our university's academic lead in a collaborative research program, Creative Fuse North East, which is working together with all 5 of the region's universities, exploring and promoting multidisciplinary fusion within regions' SMEs in order to enhance innovation capability and capacity. A side note, through Creative Fuse Northeast, we are currently able to offer some funded internships in creative and cultural sectors, but maybe we'll pick up on internships later. So my work as a design academic over the past 25 years or so has focused on developing and nurturing the creative confidence defined by the Kelly brothers as the ability to have ideas and the courage to try them out. So nurturing that creative confidence in young designers, and this creative confidence, I believe, lies at the very heart of practice across the creative and cultural industries and the education that fuels them. And so I'm deeply concerned at the apparent misunderstanding in government about the critical role of the creative subjects education in the new economy, and the consequent defunding of these subjects. As Kelly said, it's swimming exactly against the tide of what we should be doing. Art and design humanize technology, and the creative subjects support the skills pipeline for high growth creative economy sectors. I mean, as an example, whilst all of the back office operational functionality and online of the sort of online retail we've all come to rely on over the past year or so may be born out of business analytics and STEM coding skills, the usability, the inspired messaging, the communication sensibilities, and so on comes from the arts and humanities. These things have to work absolutely together. So if we diminish one, we will undermine the other. Indeed, our research in Creative Fuse has shown that the creative and cultural organizations that combine creativity, design, and digital technologies enjoy higher levels of innovation and greater income growth. And similarly, digital and tech firms that fuse their activities with those of creative sector enjoy similar successes. So post-pandemic, this fusion can and should, I believe, be harnessed at sort of regional level, and in a challenge-based way to address matters of genuine regional concern. I think we can, again, as Kelly was saying, we can work much better in those connected ways. I think graduate retention within our region in the Northeast is certainly challenging, and you know, Nick said a lot of very positive things, and I'm delighted by that. But I think it's graduate retention is variable across the region, across the 5 universities that FUSE represents, certainly. And so whilst we do see creative and entrepreneurial graduates returning later in their careers to the region, it is a problem that they leave in the first place. It's certainly very positive that these creative entrepreneurs do seek to establish themselves here when they do. But some of our research has suggested that they do so in order to achieve lifestyle and well-being balance, which doesn't necessarily translate into the sort of metrics that are used to measure, you know, traditionally used to measure growth. So I think that there's an interesting question there around employment and fulfillment, and why our entrepreneurs choose to be in our regions, and what that might mean in terms of how we acknowledge and recognize and measure what is successful in creative and cultural organizations. One last point, you know, we've seen that many micro businesses are quite reluctant to access the support that we can offer as 5 universities working together. We've been able to provide support programs that have really benefited these tiny businesses and sole traders and so on, which are very representative of creative and cultural practitioners. And I think, you know, when it comes to region-wide initiatives, taking advantage of institutions such as universities working together can be tremendously powerful. So there's something about the power of 5 there. And I suppose the last point I would make with my other hat, if you like, as an academic who's responsible for transnational education partnerships, you know, the impact of the last year on our recruitment of overseas students to the creative subjects has been significantly impacted, particularly at postgraduate level. And this is important because actually our international students do in some respects subsidize the education of our domestic students in creative subjects. So this is a really significant export market that has been badly affected by the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Mark. And that is a whole different arena, the cross-subsidy of higher education. For an MP in Sunderland, I understand that all too well, and the pandemic has certainly created some problems on that front. But thank you very much. And a good example there of partnership working between 5 universities in our bit of the north, but I'm sure that's replicated in other parts of the north, of where, you know, universities are separate entities, but working together, I think we can bring some real beneficial impacts to this area. So I'll move on to our final contributor in this part of this afternoon's programme, and that is Lee Stanley, who is the Managing Director of Sharp Futures. Lee.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here today. I do kind of feel woefully unprepared because I don't have any statistics to kind of throw around and stuff, but what I can tell you, so basically at Sharp Futures, we are a CIC based in North Manchester out of the Sharp project. We help young people into the creative and digital sectors, including TV and film. And I think from our experience as a social enterprise, it kind of starts again, and I'm kind of maybe reiterating some of the points that I've said before, particularly from Kelly, is the school's curriculum. You know, we know that arts, in terms of education, you know, that's been in decline for years. And if I'm being honest, it feels a bit like the number 47 bus. This conversation just goes round and round. It was going round and round in the 80s when I had the opportunity for the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, considering Thatcher's Britain in Manchester. You know, I actually made a career in music for 20 years, working with some of the best kind of musicians and artists in the world. And I actually kind of have to thank Margaret Thatcher for that to some small degree. But yeah, you know, in all seriousness, I think that, you know, those kind of unrepresented groups, you know, particularly working class kids, just don't have the option to, first of all, engage culturally with anything that would be considered a career. I think that, you know, private schools are fantastic at being able to enrich their curriculums with art and culture, which obviously they take full advantage of. And I think from my own experience, primary and secondary schools in disadvantaged areas, you know, it is what it is. But if you live in Charlton or Didsbury, certainly from my own experience with my kids, those areas and those catchments have parents that are middle class that can, you know, put together their own PTAs and have tens of thousands of pounds coming in to enrich their kind of schools and the experience of their children. So Chart Futures was really set up from my own experience of working in the TV, film and music industry for 20 years. And if I'm being really honest and naively, I'd never met anyone that actually had any money till I had a couple of hit records and found out that there was a whole world out there of people that made a living out of making music or being involved in the arts. And, you know, generally they were kind of public school kids along with their entourages. So I'm kind of here today because of my experience based working in music and art and having, you know, people take a good swipe at my northern accent, which, you know, is kind of fine. So we set up Sharp Futures 10 years ago. And the idea was, and I guess we're talking about pipeline now, we set something up about 5 years ago called People on Demand, which is a service we provide to TV, film and the creative and digital sectors. So basically, it's the pipeline pretty much that you've all been talking about. What we found is, and I don't know if you guys have, I'm sure your academics have studied this before in terms of that kind of working class uni kid that goes to university. Obviously, they're saddled with that huge debt when they leave and they think they're going to just walk in and be an assistant director, you know, on a film set. But actually what they end up doing is working in retail. They work in retail and any hopes of, you know, kind of further careers, or certainly they've studied for 4 years, are kind of diminished. So we've noticed that significantly in the rounds that we do when we're doing our open days for People on Demand. So we work with ITV, BBC, Channel 4 and Sky at the moment. And what we do specifically and with small and medium enterprises, I know from my own experience, you can't afford to hire someone. You've got for someone for maybe 2 or 3 hours. If you've got a social media campaign, you need something editing, post-production, etc. So that's the service that we provide. And that's working really well. It was working so well, actually, in terms of the kind of pre and post pandemic. We were in an investment phase, but that obviously went the other way. We've managed to stay where we are. And now that the TV and film industries are kind of waking up, that demand and that supply chain has come back. But, you know, it isn't easy in any sense. You know, the funding that's available for grassroots organisations, more and more, if I had a department of bid writers and procurement experts, my company would be flourishing. But, you know, there's 10 people in our organisation. We turn over, you know, £500,000 a year. In the grand scheme of things, it isn't, you know, a great amount. But I'm aware that it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to convert in terms of getting those successful bids across the line. So yeah, you know, in summary, it's really difficult. It's really difficult working at grassroots level. It's really difficult to convert and suggest to young people from working class backgrounds that there is actually a career out there. But what I think we also need to consider as well is Gen Z, millennials, Gen Z, call them what you want. You know, from my experience, those kids want a portfolio. They want a portfolio of careers. They don't particularly want to work with, you know, the BBC for 25 years. Well, not that's an option anyway, because they're all short-term contracts. But so it's interesting to listen to what those guys want. And I think that listening to what they want rather than what we prescribe in terms of what we consider a career, or certainly what we even consider culture, because that's personal anyway, isn't it? So yeah, sorry, I'm going on. I'm just going to just finish by saying, you know, the famous kind of Idris Elba quote, that the fact that you know, talent's everywhere and opportunity isn't, and that's, you know, exactly as I see it on the ground. Don't want to be pessimistic. I think it's great the fact that we're here talking today, but the challenge, you know, the challenge is real. And you know, like I said, it was real in 1989 when I was at school. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. 1989, a youngster to me. And never apologise for having a northern accent. I love northern accents and I'm very proud of mine. It's different to yours, but I love accents. I hate it when people become very, you know, just in the old-fashioned terms, a BBC accent. I think it's awful. I like a bit of a little bit of difference. But there we are. But that was a really interesting thing, and I couldn't agree with you more what you said about schools. And I don't think it's just if you live in a more affluent, you know, area like Didsbury or a less affluent area. I think it even goes down between school and school. I have schools in my patch that might be 10 minutes walk from each other, and the opportunities to kids, depending on, you know, if there's a particular parent even who has an interest in this and drives it, it can come down to. But I absolutely agree, and that seems to be a theme coming through everybody's contributions, that experiences and school curriculum is quite an issue. So thank you, Lee. So we've got some parliamentarians on the call. If any of them want to ask a question of any of the people who've already spoken, please do indicate and we will bring you in. But I'm going to fire away and I'm going to just go from dot about a bit here. So I'm going to ask Rodri first. What changes and support do you think are required to build creative skill sets in the regions so that creative careers and job opportunities can be made available to people in the regions? And I want to say not just people who are coming out of university, but right through the range of jobs that are available in your kind of world. So Rodri, would you like to go?
Thanks for that. I mean, just pick up a quick couple of points, because I think Lee puts his finger, I think, on a key thing we need to think about in the media sector, which is that it's often the supply chains that are fundamental to creative success, every bit as much as the sort of anchor employers like the BBC. And a lot of freelance staff will move very, very quickly between different organizations on different projects. And I think that is shaping our approach to talent. You know, historically, first thing we would do historically was run a lot of graduate schemes, and we became, I think, overly focused on graduates. We've shifted that substantially to apprenticeships, and we're running in any given year across the north of England, we're running about 20 to 25 apprenticeships. But again, they were very in-house focused. They were slightly on the old sort of assumption that people wanted to come into the BBC for life. And one of the things that we've set out in the new 5-year plan is to really upscale non-graduate apprenticeships to around 1,000 a year, but not to obsess about whether that talent remains within the BBC. Of course, you want a level of retention. But if you're thinking about the wider skills ecology, if you're thinking about the freelance market, if you're thinking about the supply sector, then apprenticeships through the BBC are a useful qualification for individuals to have. But we don't measure our success or failure in that activity by whether they stay for life with the BBC. I think the other point I would make, just picking up on something Kelly said, which is I think that the issue of curriculum development is key here. Now, I don't want to get into the politics of this, but I was for 10 years the director in Wales, and there's a very significant focus in the national curriculum in Wales on creative skills development, and that early inspiration, however it's done, and there are many ways to crack a nut, but that early inspiration, that early insight into the industry, I think is key. And a lot of the younger people I see coming into the business in Cardiff and Bangor and Wrexham, where I used to work, those formative experiences at school really set them on course and gave them the appetite for what they what they went on to do. So what we're piloting or planning to pilot, particularly initially in the West Midlands, is an apprenticeship training company, an ATC, which will work with the entire sector to create apprenticeships that don't just support the BBC, but support the supply chain. And I think that has to be the right model as we think about our talent development in the coming years.
Thanks very much, Rodri. And I have to say that example of how overtraining in effect for your organisation's needs, an example of that, how that worked historically, is actually in the engineering trades, in shipbuilding and mining. The shipyards and coal mines, the NCB,
that's right,
massively overtrained the plumbers, fitters, joiners, and they went out into wider industry. So it's a totally different arena, but it does work.
That's right. And if I may, just very quickly, I think it's not just about overtraining for the BBC. When we think about the BBC's commitments in areas like impartiality, the more diverse that recruitment is into the organisation, the more perspectives you've got within the sort of editorial conversations that happen within the BBC. So it's not just about we were missing out on a skill set and missing out a generation of young talent. It's also about the diversity of thinking within the organisation. And for a place like the BBC, that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Rodri. Lord Richard Inglewood wants to come in now. Richard.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Rodri, he's worked around England and Wales. Is culture in the north of England in some way fundamentally inherently different from in other parts of England and Wales? I'm different from Wales. I think it's from Scotland. There's something fundamentally different about it.
Well, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I take a view on culture that culture is messy. Culture is tied up with identity, and therefore, whether I'm Welsh or British or whether a conflation of the two, I don't think there are natural boundaries. I'm not sure there's a northern culture, because my experience of the northeast was a very particular, even to Tyneside culture. So I think geographical specificity is clearly a big driver of culture. But the old-fashioned tropes of working class culture, football culture, all that, I think is slightly tired. But I certainly think that the northeast experience I had, I don't like using the north because I think it's such a diverse space. But my experience of the northeast was quite a fundamentally different culture to what I experienced working and being educated in southern England.
But then, that being the case, how do you? You've got to try and. We're talking about this group's about the north.
Yeah.
But we're talking about. I come from Cumbria, which is different again.
Of course.
I'm different from most of the other people on the panel, I suspect. We on the one hand, we've got to embrace something that's quite wide, but it's also something that is inherently, as you said, specific and in some ways rather different. And are we trying to pin down something that's so elusive it doesn't really exist, or is there a kind of inherent solidarity across the whole thing which draws it all together and gives it a common identity?
I think there are different lenses on this. I think that when we think about class or demography, that can be unifying. When we think about geographical identity and culture, that can be unifying. So a story from, I don't know, from Cumbria, if it's about, let's say, young people's experience, can resonate with young people right across the UK. But I used to be told in the BBC many years ago that what the BBC really prized was a universality to our storytelling, something that felt rooted everywhere and sometimes nowhere. I think what we see more and more is that some of our biggest successes on screen have a deep, deep sense of place. And that gives it an authenticity and a cut through and a bite that something more generic lacks. So I mean, far be it for me to advise the committee on Northern culture, but I do think that in terms of creative growth in the television production sector particularly, being very proud and embracing what makes them, the different regions of the North feel different and feel unique and distinctive. That is increasingly a powerful driver for commissioners. I'm not sure that was always true. Granada was probably 30 years ahead of the BBC in terms of its embrace of Northern identity. But I tell you now, within the BBC, a sense of place, an authentic voice is more and more the driver of commissioning, and it needs to be. I'm not sure that answers your question.
It doesn't entirely, but it was very interesting.
Thank you very much, both. And I personally think seeing people with similar accents or places you recognise, it spikes your attention. And I think if we can do that with young people, I think that is hugely important. I mean,
forgive me, Julie. The Angels of the North is a very interesting example, because Angels of the North, which is a series on BBC Three, hugely has a massive audience in the northeast of England, but it performs well everywhere. So it resonates with a particular geography in a particular region, but it has a universal appeal across young audiences. And that's the sweet spot for a broadcaster.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to ask Kelly a question now. Kelly, you talked a lot about talent pipeline and, grassroots organisations and those kinds of things. What or how do you think we can make skills and employment programmes more accessible to young people, and particularly young people who are coming from challenging circumstances?
There was a bit of interesting conversation before about portfolio careers and precariousness. I think there was a really important point in the chat from Leela, actually, about the fact that this sector is precarious. There are a lot of freelance people, there are a lot of portfolio careers. Actually, even contracts within organisations are often quite short term. We've also had a year and a half of precariousness and constant change. When you add into that factor people with precarious lives and families perhaps who can't provide a really strong and solid safety net so that you can take those risks when you don't know where things are going, I think you've created the perfect storm of some people not being able to take up opportunities that aren't certain for very long. I think there's a sense that some areas, the areas that people want to kind of dive in and fix or help, get initiative fatigue, actually, because it's a whirlwind of people coming in with constant new ideas about how they're going to solve this problem, whichever angle or part of the problem they choose to, which lens they choose to put on it. My hope would be that any new initiative would be long and slow, and people have the opportunity to adjust themselves around it and make the best of it and make sure it's reaching the people it's intended to reach. Because, as I said before, one of my fears is that there's opportunities that are created now in the wake of COVID to help us in recovery may be hoovered up by people who were destined for this sector anyway, and it's really important that we do whatever is needed to make sure that that doesn't happen, and that takes time. So I think speed is important, and long-termism rather than short-termism feels important.
And of course, the thing with portfolio careers, if you don't have, if you're self-employed and you don't have a good track record of 5 years of accounts, you can't get a mortgage. So that's a difficult dilemma for people, isn't it? Although creatively it might be the right thing to do, but we've all got to live somewhere and pay bills. I'm going to bring my co-chair of this APPG in, James Daly, who I think's got a question. James.
Thanks very much, Julie. I couldn't agree more with Kelly, and so it's a bit hard to ask a question to somebody that you completely agree with. But hopefully Kelly and Lee, who is not too far away from where I'm sat here in Bury, can look at this. I think the debate about whether the BBC situate a drama in the north of England, and bring an act, and the nature of accents and that's very well, but that doesn't really answer the question that I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is bringing culture to towns like Bury. My interest is that in terms of culture, this is just my view, pottery, art. I want to know how a young person who is 18 years of age, who feels that they want to be a potter or want to be an artist, or how we collectively as politicians can support a wide cultural offer. Now, it's very interesting what Nick was saying about North, I think it's in North Tyneside, I do apologise. But we have to find a way of catering for and finding a way which allows, how can I put it, politics to support the widest range of cultural offers possible, and not simply allow Northern culture to be a debate about where big media organisations put their headquarters. I'm not having to go at Rodri at all here, but if you decide, a bit like government, to change your headquarters from London to Newcastle, but bring all your staff up from London to go and live in the suburbs of Newcastle, what you do is create high house prices, and it doesn't have that transformative effect. So I'd just be very interested in Lee, Kelly, and Nick, and anybody else, in terms of, we've got to bring culture close to people. When people in Bury go out the front door, they need to see culture there in front of them, not just on TV, and so they can interact with it. And so, there's all sorts of things we can do. I'm just off the top of my head, jazz festivals. We should have a complete cultural offal 365 days of the year, I think, in regions. And I just wonder what your views on those general points are.
I think that if I just pick up on one point you just mentioned there, it's fascinating to see. And again, it's something that I've seen in terms of asking people from London to come up and move into the suburbs. So as an example, the BBC, their executives would I guess traditionally move to Didsbury. And what we found, and maybe this hasn't got that much to do with the conversation, but that kind of early tutorial coaching for kids that have got wealthy parents starts in primary school. For them, by the time they leave primary school, they completely circumnavigate comprehensive skills and end up at the local grammar school. So in terms of that transferable culture that maybe middle class kids would have and talk about in the classroom, that's finished by primary school. And to your second point, it's really difficult to be prescriptive, isn't it, about culture? I think particularly working class culture, because you wouldn't normally say it would be football and that kind of way, football and music. But actually, I think that being able to normalise culture, to make by stealth, I guess that's what I'm talking about, by introducing whether the pottery workshops or jazz festivals, that actually going along to these things and breaking that hump of being involved in something like that, and maybe even considering a career from it, is that kind of...
Can I give you an example? In Bury Town Centre, there are loads and loads of empty shops.
Yeah.
Where there's no plan at the moment in terms of what we're going to do with that. In my view, as part of the culture, we should be grabbing hold of them and employing people like yourself and Kelly and other people who are interested in this sector to actually bring young people in to an inclusive environment where all sorts of culture can flourish. And I think that type of approach needs to work, especially the working class culture that you're talking about. Everybody's agree on it.
James, I completely agree with you. And there are organisations out there that do incredible work, but I think that consistency of engagement with working class communities, is rocky at best, and that's based around funding. So if somebody was interested, I don't know, by the time they got to 16 and went to FE, the provision kind of drops off. And by the time we're at university, you've got to kind of make your own way there. And obviously when you leave university and you're back to your working class roots, you kind of head scratching and come into organisations like ourselves. So the idea of a consistent provision that offers people opportunities, because I kind of hate that middle class, this is art and this is what you should all be doing. It's completely up to the individual to make their own mind up as to what they consider is art and culture. But certainly for me, I hate it when the funding runs out of something that we do. I've got 10, 15 clearly talented kids that could absolutely smash it in whichever career they decided. But I can see that as we kind of retreat, it's left to them. It's left to the parents that are working. Well, we know, don't we? We know the parents are working crazy hours. So they're left up to what they do. They're involved in the local estates, getting kids off estates, getting kids from Wythenshawe, which is 10 miles outside of Manchester, into Manchester city centre is a feat in itself. And I've been having this same conversation for 20 years plus. I think what we're discussing and what we're trying to achieve is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult.
Very, very difficult.
It really is. And I think the BBC, from my experience of working the BBC, it's a fantastic experience because, again, with ITV locally and Sky, they actually say what they're doing. It's in, this is a problem. How do we solve that problem? Whether it's apprenticeships, Your guys at the BBC work closely with our People on Demand service, and we supply young, diverse working class talent that go to the Beeb, and it's like the holy grail for them. It's like they're in, whether it's Five Live, children's, factual, they're in there. They understand what's going on. Now, obviously, it's difficult to keep funding these posts. Once they leave, they come back to our service, which is People on Demand, and then they can go on to ITV or Sky Television.
I'm gonna interrupt you there, Lee. You're so passionate about this.
Yeah,
but we've only got a few minutes left in this part of the section, and I'm going to try and bring Nick and Mark in to see if they want to comment on anything that's been said up till now, if they want to contribute to this bit.
Yeah,
I could listen to you all day, Lee, by the way.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Julie, if I can.
Yeah,
so, I think investment is key, and we talked there about some of the major institutions like the BBC and the role they can play. But I think there's also an opportunity at something like the upcoming spending review to really make the case for significant investment in the sector in places which could be slower to grow back, to help create opportunities for young people. And I think there's an opportunity there. So that means investment into skills and education, but also into the talent pipeline, and also to James's point, into local communities, into place. And I think enabling some of the reimagining of town centre places to support culture. There is an opportunity there. So I think, but investment is key with all of this. I think, there is the education piece, which is about, as Lee very passionately said, helping working class kids to firstly expose them to great teaching, great creative teaching at school level for all students, and then moving on into a kind of awareness raising piece that is about high quality careers information, advice and guidance, so that initial spark that's been lit at school, and that awareness that there is a career, that the creative industries could be a career.
Having role models to actually go into schools and talk about what they do is a huge thing in that area.
Huge, but I think also as well, moving on from that, then paid pathways. I think this is absolutely critical. So things like Kickstart, apprenticeships, internships that are actually paid, because a lot of these kids, yes, an apprenticeship opportunity or a placement opportunity that is unpaid may be attractive in terms of developing their skills, but it's not realistic to them. So having genuine paid opportunities like Kickstart, like apprenticeships, which give people the practical experience so that they can build their skills and build their understanding. I think that's absolutely critical. But I think just as a final point from me as well, the investment piece, I think access to finance is really important. So I think part of what the North of Tyne Combined Authority are doing, which James referenced, is ensuring that there is access to finance for people from the region, from diverse backgrounds, to actually secure the investments to start up if that's their interest, or to scale up if that's where their business is. But also finally, just artistic directions and directors and budget holders coming from the diverse backgrounds that we're talking about, so that they actually have an understanding of the talent that they're engaging, and actually have an interest in ensuring that talent pipeline is developed.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to come in for a final few words?
Yes, and I'll make it really brief. There are two things really I'd like to say. One is, along with the, next slide, please, the other word or phrase that we've heard a great deal of over the last 15 months or so is the use of the word unprecedented as an excuse. We haven't seen this before, therefore we've no idea what to do. And if we get it wrong, well, it's unprecedented. As a designer, as a creative, unprecedented represents opportunity to me, because as a designer, as a creative, I'm reasonably comfortable with uncertainty. And I think that is a tremendous strength that our colleagues across all of the creative sectors have as a national asset that we don't capitalize on. And I think where that comes from for these people is right back to the thing I spoke about at the beginning, this notion of creative confidence. Nurturing creative confidence means saying yes to people when they have a fragile, incomplete, not fully substantiated idea. I'm going to put a link in the chat in a moment to a short video that was recorded recently by Sir Johnny Ive, one of our alumni at Northumbria, better known as the former chief design director at Apple. And he's talking about fundamental creativity. It's a wonderful short video. I recommend that everybody watches. You could ignore the first 3 minutes and the last 2 minutes, but watch the middle. But one of the things he says is that our professional skills develop with repetition, and our creativity develops with deep care and attention. So we can get better with our skills just by doing it again and again and again. But it's by nurturing, by caring for those fragile ideas that our creativity develops and grows. And I think there's there's big lesson for all of us in that, in getting to a point where we can capitalize on that national asset of these tremendously creative people. So that's my final say. Bit of evangelism for you.
Nothing better. Well, that brings the first session of this afternoon's meeting to a close. Can I thank all of the contributors, Rodri, Nick, Kelly, Mark and Lee. I wish we'd had more time. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and we are capturing all the comments and questions that are in the chat. So please do keep putting your thoughts into the chat as I hand over to my co-chair in this APPG, James Daly, who's going to chair the next part of the session, which is looking at cultural infrastructure and levelling up funding. James.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, everybody who took part in the first session. Rather than hearing from me, it's important that we hear from our absolutely brilliant second panelists. And the first panelist we've got is Saeem Aslam, CEO of the brilliant, and I say absolutely fantastic, Bradford Literature Festival. As a man from Huddersfield, I know Bradford very, very, very well, and it is brilliant. So, Saeema, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that very, very kind introduction. It's always really lovely to hear that people have heard of the Literature Festival and to have it mentioned in such glowing terms is lovely. So thank you. I mean, listening in, sorry, I've joined slightly late, but listening in on some of the comments, I think, education has been discussed. Now, talking from the perspective of the organisation that I run, we put education at the very heart of engaging with communities and actually creating that talent pipeline. So from the experience that we have been having, we need an increased curriculum focus on creativity, and this is actually right across all the subject areas, and that needs to be backed by DCMS policy, because there is such a focus on STEM at the moment, and the arts has been increasingly ignored. And actually, in terms of future-proofing our workforce and actually those skills in terms of creative thinking, that is going to be really, really important. So that needs both policy and funding for bridge organisations, for the wider creative industries and for creative and cultural organisations. A lot of attention has been paid to cuts to the arts at secondary school level, but actually to develop that resilient pipeline for the future, we actually need to consider the challenges and what interventions we need to make right from early years onwards, so that actually children are having access to high quality, consistent, representative arts education right from the start. And that actually needs quite significant investment to actually reverse the decline that we've already had. We actually need to pay attention to the curriculum itself. There needs to be diversification around the texts, the authors that people study, the cultural history and heritage that children explore and expose to in the classroom. And that actually needs to reflect the diversity of British society as a whole. So I'm talking about both working class children, as well as Black, Asian, ethnically diverse children. Obviously, there is such an intersection across those two groups anyway. And that's really, really important when it comes to the pursuit of creative and cultural careers. And all of these groups that I'm mentioning are obviously hugely underrepresented in many areas of the cultural workforce. The sort of flip side of that is that we actually need to back that investment up with teacher training, so that the educators themselves have an understanding of what the creative and cultural economic and employment landscape looks like, with a particular reference to the North and their own region, and what opportunities are actually open to their local students, which would need to be supplemented with partnerships with local cultural organisations and creative sector companies. The stakeholders who work in this area, the bridge organisations, HE, FE, they actually need to be equipping educators and giving them the information so they can support young people to navigate those non-traditional routes. So it's not just the accountants and the doctors that are sort of easily highlighted, but when it comes to further study and employment in the arts and culture, we need the educators to have that understanding so that the parents and the caregivers have that understanding and come into that conversation, so that actually young people can be supported into these career paths in a way that looks viable and highlights the economic potential, and actually makes these careers legitimate, because I think that's a big problem, that actually careers in the creative industries are sometimes seen as something that you do as a passion or a hobby. It's not actually a legitimate career that's actually economically viable. And things like career conferences for young people, for teachers, for parents, in the way that we do for tech and STEM, those things would actually really help to demystify the routes into the sector. The other thing that is really, really important is, and we've sort of talked about this quite a lot in the past, is work experience in internship programs, and actually having ones that are adequately funded with a focus on children from working class backgrounds, ethnically diverse children and young people. And again, there's a flip side to this, because we tend to talk about having funded internships and how that's really important to actually get young people in. The flip side of it is actually the organisations. There are so many experienced, motivated organisations out there. I'd count my own organisation among this, who would love to give young people these opportunities, but we don't have the funding or the resources to be able to adequately provide this, because a lot of arts organisations are working hand to mouth. They don't have that adequate provision. I'm just going to mention a couple of other things before I run out of time. If we're actually going to encourage that movement from, if we're going to level up and have a movement from the south to the north, one of the things that we actually need to really focus on actually is infrastructure. And that's both in terms of transport. I mean, I know for Bradford, for example, we're a branch line station that has a massive impact, but also in terms of broadband. Now that's an issue that's been really been highlighted by COVID in terms of who had access to all the digital outpouring of culture that was going on and who didn't. Because if we don't do that, we're actually effectively cutting off a massive section of the population. And we do need to actually embrace digital art forms as a core art form in their own right, because otherwise, if we don't respond to the lived digital experience that children and young people have, it will compound that future talent pipeline issue. And my last point quickly is there needs to be an increase in emphasis from when it comes to funding, from Arts Council England, the National Lottery, whether it's the Heritage Lottery, in actually having education as a key criteria when it comes to funding bids.
Simon, thank you very much for that. I'm just going to go off script for a second, so I apologise to everybody. But Simon, can I ask you a question on this? In terms of the inclusive, I mean, Bradford is a wonderful, culturally diverse city that I love very much. In terms of the inclusivity of the cultural offer there and the opportunities for everybody to take, to interact with the cultural offer, are we winning or losing in terms of the, that general challenge?
I think Bradford's been on a journey with regard to these things. So if I look back, say 10-15 years ago, Bradford had things like the Mela, which was really sort of diverse, and it became part of the Bradford Festival. And that gave opportunity to everyone across the city, regardless of sort of ethnicity. I think we went through a little bit of a barren point where a lot of those things actually sort of petered out. And the National Media Museum are running all the film festivals, and they had Bite the Mango Festival, which was quite diverse as well. We had a period where we didn't have a lot, but actually Bradford seems to be, at the moment, has been going through a real cultural renaissance. Obviously, setting up the festival was part of that. Certainly from my own organisation, I know that about 50% of our volunteers are ethnically diverse. About 52% of the people who come to the festival are ethnically diverse. About 60% are coming from households with incomes which are lower than the national average, and about 28% have household incomes of lower than 20,000. So, and I think, with the creative community partnerships and sort of the lead into Bradford 2025, all of those things have been picked up, are actually very much at the forefront of the agenda, probably in a way that they weren't previously.
Brilliant. Thank you, Saima. We'll come back to you very, very shortly. We've now got Julia Samuels. Julia is from 20 Stories High. I can't see you on the screen, Julia, but hopefully you're there and the floor is yours. Go for it, Julia.
Thank you very much. So yeah, okay. So when I looked at the questions, the first thing that struck me is the way not to do the 4 things that the questions want to do is to deprioritise creative subjects in school, which has obviously systematically happened in recent years. And definitely not to defund creative subjects at university, which is currently being proposed. I caught a bit at the end of the last conversation, so I know these things have been in the room this afternoon. But so assuming those, like we sort that out, that I'll offer, I'll put those to one side for a minute, and I'll offer 20 Stories High, the company that I co-run, as a case study of how we approach some of these things in the questions. I'll give you a bit of background. So we're a theatre company based in Liverpool. We make work with and for young people. We mean sort of 13 to 30-year-olds. And we particularly prioritise those from culturally diverse working class backgrounds. Our tagline as a theatre company is everybody has a story to tell and their own way of telling it. So we're really interested in what those young people bring with them. We've been going for about 15 years and we're predominantly funded by Arts Council England, Culture Liverpool, as well as trusts and foundations. So our approach is that we've got different strands of work which interconnect, and I think there's something in this joined up approach that allows us to grow engagement in the arts in a holistic way, offering a range of opportunities for young people to participate in the arts, to be audiences, and then developing themselves as professional artists with freelance careers. So to break down the strands a bit, we have at the baseline of what we do is that we've got a youth theatre. It's a weekly provision for young people. Artists lead those sessions, a range of artists. It's free to access, there's no auditions. We recruit young people through outreach work and community partnerships. We offer pastoral support for our participants, which is so significant in terms of retention, and loads of the young people who come to us engage for a really long time. And I think that's really key if we're thinking about building up a workforce in the future, or people really being able to develop these transferable skills that you get through creative practice. Youth theatre. The sort of a progression strand is something that's called Launch, which is a professional development programme. We piloted this just before the pandemic, and it was a scheme, a programme mostly for young artists who hadn't seen university as the route for them. A few of the people on the programme had been to university, but what they hadn't got from it was a range of practical, and it was like a practical and supported route into setting yourself up as a freelance artist, particularly for people who haven't got that sort of like social confidence or capital or families who are going to support them or have knowledge of that industry. So we brought in a range of highly experienced professionals from diverse backgrounds, and crucially from across the UK as well. So they met a lot of professionals from Liverpool, but broadened it out as well to increase their networks. They had a range of sessions on lots of things, from like working out your own values as an artist, to communication skills, to building partnerships. They gained peer support and confidence from the cohort, kind of understood that this work can be me, I can have a career like this, other people like me have careers like this, and I'm networked amongst my local peers, but I also have networks nationally. It was a really exciting scheme, and there's been really positive feedback, and we're going to get back on with it after when things are back to normal. The third sort of strand is that we have professional shows and projects. These are made by a collaboration between experienced artists and people who might have been through Launch or through youth theatre. Quite often it's people's first professional jobs, and we support them in what it means to have a professional freelance role as an artist, because again, that's a complex thing if you're not used to it, and it does need support. Young people are involved in the development creatively of the pieces themselves that we make. So when we show those to young audiences, the kind of feedback that we get is that the stories and work is relatable or inspiring. So you're reaching young people who then might like to participate or go to other stuff or get involved in making work themselves. These shows reach audiences through theatre tours and community tours, as well as digital platforms. And for example, we've got a show that we created with a couple of young artists in Liverpool, which is on the iPlayer at the moment as part of the Culture and Quarantine programme. It's worth noting that we used to talk quite a lot into schools, and since the schools have had to be so, or since they've reduced their abilities to bring the arts in so much, that has really, really decreased, and we see that. And we used to go into lots of youth clubs, and they don't really exist anymore. So we're
Julia, can I just ask you a question, just building on what you're saying? I mean, from my perspective, what you're saying is absolute dynamite. I mean, the inspiration that you're providing and support for young kids wanting to get into the sector is brilliant. Now, in terms of funding, obviously you've outlined, the funding streams that you've got at this moment in time, but in general, not just in respect of your work, but if we as politicians want to look at the way of funding organisations such as yours throughout the north of England, how do you foresee a funding model working that gives you and your fellow colleagues who are doing this work the opportunity to get out into the community and inspire so many people?
That's a really interesting question. We get about half of our money at the moment from the Arts Council on our 3-year national portfolio contract, which I heard somebody say before, but that's about as stable as it gets. And then the rest of it we're getting from a small amount from Culture Liverpool, and then small amounts from trusts and foundations, and we try and earn some income, but what we do doesn't earn you lots of income. So we're used to having a portfolio of money, but we have to use a lot of resource to get the money to do the work, and it's always insecure. Like 3 years feels like a luxury, but actually the kind of work I'm describing, if you want to really, I've been talking to a young woman this week about a play we want to make together. She's now like 28 or something. I've known her since she was 16, and a sort of like a young woman just walking to a youth theatre going, what's this drama? I've never done it before. This stuff like needs a level of sustainability and long term. So I think longer term contracts would be brilliant, and less work to get the money. I mean, let us prove the money's been worth it.
Less paperwork, you mean? Less bureaucracy.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Julia, can I come back to you in a second? Because we need to talk more about this. Can I just bring in Craig Pennington? Craig, are you there?
Hello.
Hiya, Craig. The floor is yours. Craig, you're from Future Yard. Can you tell us something about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so Future Yard is a new community music venue in Birkenhead, just on the other side of the river from Liverpool here in Merseyside. And the underpinning idea of what we're doing is trying to reimagine the role of a music venue within a local community. So yeah, we put on brilliant live shows. We provide a platform for touring artists. We also provide, infrastructure for artists to kind of make their first steps into playing live on stage. But we do that in a part of the world where currently kind of cultural provision is low. Birkenhead and the Wirral don't have any national portfolio organisation to the Arts Council, for example, and engagement is traditionally low. So the idea really is, how do you use a community music venue to really kind of like reimagine kind of like potential and the opportunity of what kind of cultural kind of provision looks like in a place like Birkenhead. So we have our core program and the shows that we present, and the core kind of content that we put on. But alongside that, we also have a skills and training pathway, and also a dedicated focus on artist development. So it's all about kind of like reimagining all of the skills and professional practice that come together in a music venue such as ours, and then looking to build kind of structured training pathways for local young people so they can develop the skills that they need to then go on and enter employed careers within the live music industry, which is a strategically important industry locally in this part of the world, and obviously a huge export industry internationally for the UK. It's really, really, really about thinking about the young people who wouldn't go and look at these kind of pathways through university or through college. And when you've got a place where, live music venues don't exist, it's about kind of almost kind of painting the picture of the possible to young people.
Exactly.
And then,
Craig, politicians like me often use the phrase levelling up. And what you've just described there to me is levelling up in action. And I just get back to, I'm sorry to get that back to Cash, because the work that you're doing is clearly brilliant. But in terms of how the work that you're doing, not only as a venue to provide a facility for people to have a cultural experience and for bands and other organisations to work, how do you feel that in terms of funding and support, how could that be better to help you do the work that you're doing? Because it's clearly having a massive impact in your area.
I think the key is to recognise organisations like ours and the supply chain that we are part of in the regions as being essentially a kind of skills and training kind of machine, which is currently in hibernation. For me, you look at the embodied kind of skills that are inherent within organizations like ours. We've structured our organization as a CIC, and every role is there as a training pathway for local young people, supported by a professional. That's because I originally, at the start of my career, came through a students' union infrastructure where that was the culture of our organization. Our intention is to take that and put that in a community music venue in a part of the world where it's really, really needed. But any organization, any business, any kind of cultural institution as part of our supply chain within the live music industry could provide those pathways for young people. The issue is, it goes back to something that I think one of the speakers said earlier, is that we don't have the infrastructure or the finance or the funding or the resource to be able to do that. So, we can go to the Arts Council and get funding for a particular program or shows or a particular kind of, body of work. But if there was some kind of scheme which gave us capacity to utilize what we do and create training pathways and give us the provision in-house in order to be able to train local young people, kind of reimagining what we do as a kind of skills kind of machine, that would be really transformational. That's what we're doing. That's our model. But there's not many other organizations like ours, certainly within the music industry, that operate in that way.
And that's regeneration in action, isn't it? In terms of skills training, in terms of economic activity, the creation of jobs, the creation of life chances, opportunities. And therefore, as you say, the challenge is to get the state funding, whether it's through third-party agencies or through the state itself, direct to you, because you're doing the work on the ground, which is having the positive impact, which is not happening otherwise. Craig, do you mind if I come back to you in a second? I just want to hear from somebody else, because that's absolutely brilliant. Hannah Blameyer. Hannah is a freelance production manager. Hannah, are you there?
I'm here. Hello, yes.
Hi, Hannah.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks for inviting me today. It was really great to hear all the brilliant points that the other panelists have made. I guess I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, as I don't work for an organisation. I'm a freelance production manager, and I've been working in theatre and events for about 10 years now. I've been asked to come and speak to you today by Freelancers Make Theatre Work. Freelancers Make Theatre Work is a freelancer founded and led community for the 200,000 plus self-employed and freelance workers from all areas of theatre, opera, dance and live performance. We make up 70% of the UK theatre's workforce, and we're usually underrepresented in these kind of things, so thanks for inviting me today. I know we've already spoken about this quite a lot today, but based on my experience and the pathway that I took into the industry, I really want to advocate for the reframing of arts subjects in education. They're not soft subjects, they require technical skill, self-motivation to practice, being really meticulous in the detail, and they produce, well-rounded individuals who cope well in rapidly changing environments. They solve problems creatively and often become leaders in society. It's estimated that about 38,000 freelancers have left the creative industries in 2020, which represents a huge loss of skills and experience. But what it does go to show is the level of transferable skills that you gain working in these jobs. I know stage managers that have gone into teaching, production managers that are now working for building design consultants, and actors who are offered manager roles within 2 weeks of starting a job in a supermarket. These people were getting jobs when unemployment figures were rising. There also needs to be more education around the breadth of roles that are available in the arts. I was really lucky at high school to have a brilliant drama teacher who didn't really know much about technical theatre, but saw that I was interested and went away and learnt about it so that she could teach me. I was also very lucky to have, very supportive parents, which I think is crucial. When deciding whether to do a GCSE in music, drama or art, it often feels like you're kind of putting yourself out there and saying, I want to be a musician or an actor or an artist, which is a very daunting decision to make, and one that I'm sure a lot of parents would worry about. I just wonder how many potential future band tour managers, lighting designers or art curators have been put off studying a foundation in their subject because of a woeful lack of information about the career possibilities. And then finally, something else that we've spoken about quite a lot, we all know that the coronavirus pandemic has been devastating for the arts, but in addition to this, we get to see the full impact of Brexit. For many companies, the only way that they make any actual profit is by touring overseas, and this money is then ploughed back into their education and engagement programmes in the UK. In the absence of the promised bilateral agreement allowing groups to tour visa-free in the EU, these funding streams are going to dry up, and the gap needs to be plugged, otherwise otherwise we're going to see more doorways closed on future talent. So yeah, I think that that's something that really needs to be thought about and addressed. It's been a tough year, but we've got the opportunity to reset better, and I'm hopeful that we can come back and start to make some positive changes to help the industry come back not only stronger, but more ambitious, diverse and sustainable than ever.
Now, this is a bit of a big question, but I apologise for putting it. I don't know whereabouts you're from, Hannah, and forgive I won't ask that. But in the sense of, you know, I think personally, I think it's important that we have cultural job opportunities, career opportunities, you know, locally, you know, regionally, you know, throughout the country. I just wondered where we are now, and you know, where we're going in the months. Hopefully, we're going to get back to some kind of normality at the earliest opportunity. What do you think we should be doing in terms of? There's one thing about training, and I agree with everything that you said, and those opportunities. But in terms of the cultural venues and the cultural events and the different things that we can hopefully have in this country going forward. Have you got any ideas about how you think politicians should interact with those, how we can encourage those, create more job opportunities?
I mean, obviously, there's lots of regional arts organisations that have got brilliant ideas and no money to make them a reality. If you look at places like Hull, when they got Capital of Culture, that was just completely transformative. I worked there for quite a lot of the events, and it totally changed the city, and the engagement levels were so high. And yeah, I think it gave people like a real pride in where they came from, you know, particularly in a city that had, yeah, again, been like decimated by the loss of fishing and industry, and really was sort of felt like it was on its knees in many ways. But I think that the success of that was people working with the arts organisations that already existed in the city, and giving them funding to do the projects that they wanted to do.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think hopefully one of the things about the pandemic is giving us all more a sense of the importance of place and where we're from, the cultural offer in every town, village and city where we're from, and hope we can develop from that. Hannah, I'll be coming back to you very, very shortly, but can I just finish off, please, by asking Chris Strong. Chris is Director of Skills and Employability at IVE. Chris.
Thank you, James, and great to be here. Really appreciate being invited to this. IVE is a charity based in Leeds. Our raison d'etre has and continues to be to develop creativity, both in education and now as a core skill from the classroom to the boardroom. Our tagline is building a creative nation that embraces change. Creativity is the ability to apply your imagination. It's the process to create something of value, and it is what drives innovation. If innovation is the lifeblood of an organisation or our economy, then creativity is the nourishment that sustains it. If we want to support young people to explore careers in the creative and cultural industries, here are some key points for consideration. What is on our doorstep and how do I access it? We know the heady data, we've heard about it today, how the creative industries brings hundreds of billions of pounds into the UK economy, but how that translates to the local is less straightforward. And when we consider the high percentage of SMEs, micro businesses and freelancers, those career paths can start to feel intangible or risky to a young person or their family. We therefore need to make sense of this amorphous sector with clearer mapping of creative and cultural industries and local level information so that young people, teachers, carers, careers advisors and parents, guardians and carers can connect with businesses and those opportunities. Recognising the complexity of these industries, we should invest in sector specialist connector organisations to engage employers actively in local areas, brokering relationships between training providers, colleges and employers, and designing dynamic pathways and programmes. The business case for our cultural sector organisations. We need to be proud of the significant role they play in bringing our regions to life, making a place people want to live, settle, work and enjoy themselves in. They should be considered with equitable voice, resource and support in planning, placemaking and other developments. Cultural sector organisations need specialist support to help consider being commercial and how to go about doing it. Many cultural sector organisations are charitable third sector organisations that rely on grant funding. Grant funding is an essential part of the mix, but profit doesn't need to be a dirty word, particularly if it helps to sustain organisations increase charitable activities, or test out new ways of working. In fact, that can lead to increased independence and stimulate innovation. Why is that important in terms of young people and careers? Well, if we want to attract people into the cultural sector, it needs to remain buoyant, thriving, and sustainable. We're entering a time where millions of jobs are at risk of being displaced with the unfolding of the fourth industrial revolution. Indeed, COVID-19 is likely to accelerate this change. We must make the in-demand skills relating to creativity an explicit part of school curriculum and wider education training programs. If you look at the research by organisations like the World Economic Forum, Nesta, or in LinkedIn, you'll see the top in-demand skills, and for now and in the future, include creativity, problem solving, persuasion, collaboration, adaptability, emotional intelligence. All of these are important skills in the creative process. These soft skills are not always the easiest to test, but they're in demand and they're resilient to the disruptive transformation that faces our workforce. Our cultural sector plays a vital role in developing many of these skills, albeit sometimes implicitly via their incredible array of education and youth programmes. If we could harness this range of interactions that cultural sector organisations have with young people, we can help make these skills more explicit and better realised. We might also want to consider how the cultural sector can prepare young people to access their broader supply chains, such as retail, tourism, and the wider creative industries, so they form that key part of the talent pipeline. And finally, we must champion diversity in all its facets. If creativity is the nourishment of innovation, diversity is the catalyst for creativity. The creative case, the business case, the human case for diversity are irrefutable. And if we want to attract diverse groups of creative young people into our sector, we must address our own issues of inclusion and access and champion centre stage diversity in all its guises. Diversity is ingrained in the way many young people live their lives. Their fresh perspectives can help us to explore, research, and rethink our narratives and to appreciate our culture in different ways. They revitalise our heritage and help ensure sustainable purpose in our culture and its future. Young people are the curators, front of house, directors, visitors, volunteers, donors, and advocates of tomorrow. And their unfiltered ways of looking at things can help us push us out of our comfort zone, solve problems, and make radical progress.
Chris, thank you very much for that. I mean, that's covered so many things, and we there are many things that come out of that. I'm going to bring Julie and Lord Inglewood in a second to speak to the panelists. But Chris, just one question in terms of, could a lot of detail there, Chris, and we can't talk about it all in the time that we've got. But if we're looking at important steps that the sector and politicians and everybody can play in terms of how we unlock access to culture, to opportunities, you know, to get that supply chain of talent going. I'm sorry, that's not a very articulate way of going. What do you think is of describing that? What's the most important, or what's something we can take away from this? You think is something that's an easy win, something we can do pretty much straight away?
I think Kelly hit the nail on the head when she said we need to work together, all of us, in a connected way. And also that this needs to be long-term planning, because we all have to react to short-term project stuff. You know, there's tons of brilliant work that goes on all over the place, but it's inconsistent and it's in pockets. So some way of joining all of this up into a joint strategy is absolutely essential. And we need to work out how we link it to national organisations and initiatives like the Careers Enterprise Company. Anything that involves, I think, with schools, anything that gets measured gets done. And so I think there's a key role in terms of what a Ofsted inspector's looking for, and does that tally with what the creative sector can offer, what skills the creative sector needs, and also how does that connect with things like Gatsby benchmarks and what actually good careers work in schools looks like.
Thank you, Chris. And I mean, one of the reasons why myself and Julie and all the other committee members are so passionate about this is we want this to sort of be a part of that process of working together, that joined up thinking, which is going to get good outcomes. Can I just go to Julia? Julie, we were discussing some of the fabulous work that you're doing, but in terms of those career pathways, getting people into that conveyor belt of talent, into jobs and into opportunities, what's your we heard about your, but you've got lots of experience in the sector. What else do you think we should be doing?
I think we need to recognise. I think it's interesting, like listening to Hannah talk about the freelance experience and the precariousness. And I think that over this last year, we've become more and more aware of that. And then we understand better its link to how the creative workforce hasn't always been fully inclusive and representative. And I think that I think that we need to look at schemes for building freelance careers and not just assume that people come with all of that knowledge and that resilience, and that actually if we really believe, like, the creative workforce relies a lot on freelancers, and that more needs to be done by arts organisations, cultural organisations, but also education partners and other, like, the apprenticeships and stuff. I think we should really look at what equipping somebody with the skills to have a successful freelance career looks like.
Brilliant. Thanks, Julia. Craig, can I just ask you a question? Every town needs a Craig Pennington, clearly, but I don't know whether in terms of when you were describing, you obviously did very much about place. And you are providing a facility and you're from the area that from the area where you've lived all your life, and you're putting something back into the community. I mean, I don't know how do we have more of what you're delivering in your area, Craig, do you think? How can we encourage that? What do we do?
You enable local people to be able to kind of take ownership of what that placemaking looks like. I think that, culture-led kind of like regeneration has kind of been viewed very much as like a top-down approach. And I'd like to kind of give, some recognition to the way that Wirral Borough Council have engaged people like me over the past 4 or 5 years, and have made a very, very kind of dedicated effort to kind of tease out those green shoots at the early stage, so that the vision for what that place might be comes from the bottom up, and then they support that on a long-term kind of journey. We were only ever going to create Future Yard in Birkenhead because that was our vision, because we believe that Birkenhead's got its own story to tell, and music is the best way through which we can do that. But I think having, a cohesive approach around regen, around placemaking, around inward investment, which has got culture absolutely at its heart, is central to that, and those ideas coming from the people themselves.
Yeah, I can't see Julia or Lord Inglewood, but please interrupt me, guys, if you want to ask anything.
Can I come on with a question?
Of course, Lord Inglewood.
After there seems to be general agreement, with which I entirely concur, that creativity is important for wealth creation in the country in the future, because the way in which creativity frames the way your mind works makes you better at solving problems. I think that's a simple way of putting it. Therefore, this discipline is important for the future of wealth creation in this country. Most of the discussion that we've had relating to what I call the economic / financial framework of the way in which a lot of this happens, and highly arguably not enough of it happens, has been focused on the public sector. If this is so important for wealth creation in the future, how do you catalyze the private sector to produce more money, bearing in mind, as a number of people have said, if you're the BBC, you're not necessarily only going to provide apprenticeships for those who work in the BBC all their time. How do we find, in a way where there's going to be huge pressure on public sector budgets, ways of making money available to deliver the process of enhancing people's creativity and in parallel their cultural awareness, in order to create wealth for this country in the future?
Saima, can I come to you in respect to that, Lord Inglewood's question?
Yes, of course. I think in terms of the engagement with the private sector, I think that there are a few things. And just listening to colleagues who've been speaking about the work that they are doing, I think with the private sector, I mean, creating turning things into a revenue generating opportunity. Some of the work that is being done, say by the Bradford Literature Festival, for example, is only ever going to be attractive as a CSR type of opportunity, or for organisations who, as has been sort of the case over the last couple of 100 years, organisations who want to be connecting with organisations who can show them in the right light. I think if we're going to turn the creative industries into something that is actually generating profit, it's probably a case of actually segmenting things, because some of the work that is being done in terms of young people and looking to future pipelines is not necessarily going to be attractive to the private sector, because it is not going to provide that fast turnaround. It might be attractive if we can link internships as routes into creating things that will then actually generate profit, and that can be international opportunities. There is a massive opportunity in terms of inward bound tourism, and placemaking obviously is a really big part of that, and those kinds of things could be really attractive to the private sector. I think digital in itself presents a massive opportunity. It's a great way for us to showcase the UK, but also actually in terms of getting the private sector involved in a way where there is actually monetization as well. But I think, in terms of the culture sector, from what I have seen over the last year, that is something, particularly with smaller organisations. I think the larger organisations have been able to grasp that nettle quite quickly, that people are still coming to terms with. I don't think there's an easy answer. I think there is a collaboration that can happen between private and public, and I think the big organisations are actually quite experienced and have the resource and infrastructure to actually utilise that, but a lot of it tends to be around sort of sponsorship and private giving. I think there's a lot more work that needs to happen in terms of how we monetise things, because even the larger organisations have a lot of subsidy.
I mean, I think, as we all agree, the culture is an essential part of the North's economy. So, Chris, can I just ask you to give your view on what Lord Ingwood's asked?
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer, to be honest with you. I mean, what we've been doing at IVE is looking at how we develop our commercial work. What does our offer look like to the private sector? What that might they be interested in, so that we can take profit from that to support our charitable work. So it's not about sort of direct giving of funding from private sectors so much as it is about this value and this need for creativity across all industries and sectors as a absolute in demand human capacity and skill, and that's built relationships where we've had organisations help support us to run things like artist auctions, or to support young people to have more cultural engagement. But it's sort of thin and far apart, and I think it's something that we continue to learn about as we go along. I'm interested that, does this happen in other sectors? Why is this a thing for the arts and cultural sector?
Yeah. Well, Ingwood, is there anything else you'd like to ask?
No, I'm just grateful for the responses, and I didn't ask a question to make because it was easy. I made the question because I didn't know the answer. I'm nearer, but I'm not there yet.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing to Lord Ingwood's point? That I think that it also partly comes down to the value of art, and again, that it comes right back to the start about how do we value this? Is this just a group of people who've somehow managed to turn their hobby into a job? And yeah, how as society do we value culture and value art? And then then it's, you're more able to add a kind of monetary figure to it. But whilst we kind of whilst it isn't treated as having the same value as other topics or in other industries, then it's much more difficult for people to see how that might be monetized. I think you also lose some freedom in the art forms as well, to be provocative. If there's somebody who's got a stake in it and somebody who needs to make money from it, we lose that kind of political edge to say the things and to provoke audiences and responses and reactions in the way that art has always done.
Absolutely.
That's right. But the problem is, if it's a choice between the health service or the arts, generally in the political process as we know it, the health service wins.
Yeah, of course. But what is the benefit to people's health by having, you know, an involvement in culture and the way that that impacts cities, and the way that that kind of lifts people up and, you know, makes people able to think of bigger things other than their situation. I think that the impact is far-reaching.
Thank you, Hannah. Julie?
Thank you. And the bells have just stopped ringing, so it's a good time to bring me in. I wanted to ask Hannah, as a freelancer, you know, a huge number of people who work in this area are freelancers and have had a very difficult year. But for young people coming through the education system, even if we put right what's wrong with the education system in terms of bringing this pipeline of people through, what as a freelancer would you say the thing that was missing that we could perhaps do as policymakers to make being a freelancer, which is always going to be part of this, this ecosystem, make the transition from education and training into the workplace easier for somebody coming in as a freelancer?
I think I'd say the two things are, and I don't know how much control the government has over it, but like really brilliant role models and mentorship being available, you know, throughout education. I had some really fantastic opportunities whilst I was studying to go and do a placement with an organisation called Walk the Plank in Manchester, and I can link almost every job that I've ever had in the 10 years since then back to that placement, because they were run well, they were well funded, and it was working with a large team of people, and the network that I made working on big projects right from, you know, before I even left university. Yeah, I would meet, you know, 10 other stage managers on a project, and the links that come out of that was completely invaluable. And the other thing that I think is a bit of a scourge for freelancers at the moment is the kind of eggy line between being self-employed and PAYE. So this is part of the reason why so many people fell through the gaps of all the support that was available, that the government has said that organisations need to, particularly like theatres and buildings that are employing crew to come in, they have to pay them on a PAYE basis, even though they're essentially on 0 hours contracts. Whereas actually, I think being properly self-employed gives you more financial stability and freedom, and there's several roles within the arts that now people are being told you've either got to go and become a limited company or we have to pay you as PAYE, and the impact that has on how you can expense things which are genuine expenses. For me, if I had to do a lot of my work as PAYE instead of being self-employed, my expenses might be, you know, £10,000 for the year, which sounds like a lot of money, but if I'm getting the train to here, there and everywhere all the time and not just working in my local area, having to stay overnight in places, all of those expenses that are genuine, yeah, that just then makes it really financially tricky for people to make it a sustainable career. So I think that needs to be looked at.
So you think a simplification of the differences between PAYE and genuine self-employment?
Yeah, I think it definitely needs to be looked at again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, James.
Great, can I bring you back in? I think you have a point you wanted to make.
So it was just a little bit more on the point that Lord Inglewood made. I think that rather than looking at kind of public and private as two binary things, there's a lot of power that the public sector has to kind of shape the behaviours of the private sector and where investments is made. Just looking at one example of a scheme locally, we were able to take some investment for one of our training programs through a social housing provider who essentially put a levy on one of their suppliers. So they had to invest a certain amount of money in community projects such as ours in order to get the contract with the housing provider. So obviously the government has a huge raft of procurement contracts and buying power that's there, and they can shape the terms of those arrangements. And if we really, really prioritise investing in the cultural industries in the way that we're talking about, it should be at the forefront of that queue of looking at which kind of parts of the economy those kind of relationships and those supply relationships can then benefit.
Lord Inglewood, have you got anything else you want to add to this discussion?
I think for now I've said plenty, thank you.
No problem at all. In the chat, and there's some brilliant, there are too many brilliant contributions for me to read them all out, but I think what's really important is the point that Lord Inglewood and some of the panelists were talking about the positive impacts in all sorts of ways of investment in the cultural sector in the north and throughout the country. Now, again, I'm going off script, so forgive me, APPG, but Nick Grimshaw, are you still with us?
Absolutely, James.
I'm going to give you another go, Nick. After all the things you put in the chat, just give us your thoughts on what you've heard.
On which element specifically, James?
Well, obviously you put a lot of contributions in the chat. Just think in terms of how the conversation's gone forward.
Yeah, so I think just on Lord Inglewood's point, as the distinction between healthcare and the arts, and our funding goes to healthcare is absolutely right. But I suppose one of the points I was making was that positive impact of the arts on health and well-being is being increasingly better understood through social prescribing, and as the evidence base grows through social prescribing, as the evidence increasingly supports that actually investment in the arts has a direct impact on health and well-being, I think that case will be much easier to make. So I think watch this space in terms of the research coming out of social prescribing. It should help with that conversation. But I think also just on the point about engaging the private sector, I suppose our experience of that is trying to understand the value proposition outside of purely traditional arguments for the arts. And I think a few people have mentioned this before, and forgive me, I can't remember all the names, but about the positivity of creative thinking in the private sector and the appreciation of innovation, and a lot of entrepreneurial ideas and innovative ideas come out of the creative industries and come out of creative thinkers. So helping to make that to articulate that point to the private sector and the value to them of having creativity and innovative thinking, I think is something that certainly has leverage for us.
Great, thank you, Nick. Can I just ask, bring Simon back in again, in terms of, it's a sort of point I was trying that Craig described far more articulately than me, that in terms of the cultural offer, we've talked about the education, the support that people in the sector need to have that pathway to that conveyor belt of talent. But Simon, if Haworth has got a few advantages with the Brontes in terms of a cultural offer and bringing people in, so as other areas. I just wondered what you felt in terms of, you run a fantastic literature festival, that to but to develop the cultural output for various places, do you think that areas need to look at not only how we support people, but what they're actually offering in terms of festivals, or like Craig's brilliant facility? Do you think we as politicians need to be investing in ideas that people can actually see every day when they're in their local communities, and know that 4 or 5 times a year we're going to have this festival or whatever it may be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the creative and the cultural infrastructure of a place is really, really important. And actually, I think these points have been made previously. It's about having a sustained offer. So what happens too often in the creative sector and the culture sector is there is a brilliant idea, it gets funded, it happens and it's amazing and everybody loves it. And then the funding goes away because the funders now want a new brilliant idea. So that sustainability isn't there. And I think Julia referenced this as well. And a lot of the work that actually needs to be done to create, deep-seated change, all of which will have economic benefits, in terms of people going into all the other sectors. So when we think about children from deprived backgrounds who don't have the opportunities, who are not getting the educational opportunities, who are then not getting inspired because they can't see themselves reflected either in the curriculum or on stages or just in what's happening in their local parks. All of those are missed opportunities. And actually, if we can create a sustained cultural infrastructure where children are running into those opportunities, and some of this is about, if we actually are serious about levelling up from the point of view of working class children, and I think I said this previously, children who are from diverse backgrounds have a real intersection when it comes to working class communities. We tend to talk too often about, we have the working class communities over here, and then we have our diverse communities over here. too often they are one and the same. The middle classes, regardless of their ethnicity, look, or the colour of their skin, look pretty much the same in terms of opportunity. But actually, to create change for those children, you need to provide things that they are going to run into, that their parents are going to stumble across, where there aren't those barriers to access. And actually, that step that they need to make is really, really shallow. So, for example, with the festival, our education programme is completely free, so that there are no barriers for schools. We take the programmes into schools, we pull the schools back out again. We target the schools because actually that's the way to get those children to, it's the whole marketing thing of pester power that you have with toys. It's the same thing with the festival. We have an offer for children actually in City Park, because that's Bradford on the beach, and where a lot of those families actually go and have their day out. So they just fall into the offer. So it's actually creating that kind of infrastructure to actually create meaningful change.
Simon, thank you very much for that. We are desperately running out of time, but I'd like to bring Katie Shaw in. Katie's our, I hope this is the correct time, academic partner, Katie, doing a brilliant job. Katie, what do you think about what you've heard today?
Hi there. Yeah, I think it's really telling for me, speaking here as researcher in residence for the inquiry, how much we're hearing about partnership working and how much we're hearing about leveraging resource in terms of building a creative skill set in the regions through working with all levels of education, so getting the early years harnessed all the way through to higher education, but also the capacity to build in industry involvement from the go, so how we can use industry in terms of thinking about curriculum design and delivery and assessment, and how we can really embed equality of opportunity also throughout here, so we can start thinking about diversity across the North. And I was really pleased to hear a lot of people talk about the fact that North is not homogenous. We have incredibly diverse needs, and the importance of representing freelancers. The North is not just cities, it's city regions, it's our coastal communities, it's broad, it's permanent staff and freelance, and everybody has such very different needs and requirements in a post-COVID context. So we'll be taking all of the evidence from the chat and everybody's oral evidence today forward for the report.
That's brilliant. Can I thank everybody for all our fabulous panelists for taking part in this discussion, everybody who has been watching and taking part interactively. I think Katie summed up everything that needs to be said in respect of how the inquiry is going to go forward. But can I ask my fellow parliamentarians if they've got anything to say? Julie, Lord Inglewood, is there any final comments you'd like to make?
I thought it was an interesting, enjoyable session. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just say how it's fascinating how much crossover there is from all the different people we've heard talk with us today, and some of the key themes are starting to emerge very much, and I think that's always positive, that our thinking is on the right lines of what needs to happen. So just really thank you to everyone for taking part and giving their time this afternoon. It's been a really informative session, I think. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much to everyone. I'm astounded we finished about 90 seconds early, because that's not normally how I chair these things, but I want to say thank you to everyone. We are genuinely trying to work, I know you hear politicians say this all the time, but we want to work together to try and create better outcomes and try and influence government policy for the better and take up all the points that have been made. So thank you very much indeed, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.
Thank you, James. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.